Hello, Tubby and Coos fans. It's me, Candace, back for our third author event this week and our last author event of February. I am excited to talk to Elise Arden today. And I know I'm always excited, but I truly am always excited. With Elise, if you may or may not know, based on how many times Elise and I have been together, or you may have seen Elise at the store, that we are buddies and friends, and Elise helps me out with a lot of things, and I'm able to call or text her when I'm freaking out and I about store stuff, and I like or about just whatever, the inauguration. So that's always fun. Elise is born and raised in New Orleans. She is from the French Quarter and still basically lives there, and lives close to it. I'm not sure. She'll have to say. I think where she lives is still the French Quarter, but it's like right there. But anyway, she wrote the Casquette Girls series, which I know so many of you have read. It's been one of our best-selling books basically since the store opened. Our best-selling series basically since the store opened. So the first book was the Casquette Girls, and the fourth book, The Gates of Guinée, has come out at the end of January. So Elise has released that book. And she also wrote a graphic novel, Zatanna, for DC. That's coming out later this year, maybe early next year, something like that. She can tell you. And also, Elise has been here in New Orleans forever, a fellow New Orleanian, and I'm really excited to talk to her today. So welcome, Elise.
Hi everybody.
That was a super off the cuff intro.
Hey,
so Elise has written things and done stuff.
Works for me.
So tell us, for those folks who are watching, who may have never heard of the series at all, tell them a little bit about what the series as a whole is about. My dog is whining, so I'm going to pick it up.
Okay. Thanks for having me. Hi, guys. I'm Elise Arden, and I'm a writer of the Cascade Girl series, among other things. So I know that this is not my first time on the Tubby and Coos channel, but we always kind of assume that there are new people to the community. So even though we are promoting The Gates of Guinée, as Candace said, which is the fourth book, this is the first book in the series that kind of started it all, the Casquette Girls. And so there's 4 books so far. The 5th one will be out next year. No date released yet. And they are sequential. Like, you can't read them out of order, really, like, at all.
And will the 5th one finally be the last one?
Yes. The 5th one is definitely, for sure, the last book. And it's called The Immortal Germain. That's pretty much the only thing that's been released about it. It picks up where this book leaves off, where this book leaves off. And if you've read that, you're like, it better. So the series is a New Orleans-based series, and it essentially takes different urban legends from the French Quarter primarily and ties them together into like one long multi-generational narrative. So the first book, so it's very urban fantasy, paranormal urban fantasy, paranormal romance, kind of depending on the book, on the arc, or like where your kind of spectrum slides along those scales, because I feel like those things are a bit subjective depending on the reader or the writer. So the first book takes some of our vampire urban legends. I would say that the whole series is like a witch series. So there's different supernaturals along the way, but the first book focuses on the vampire urban legends, and it kind of asks the question of like, what if the main like 3-ish vampire urban legends were all tied together over like 4 centuries? And there is a historical plot line in almost all of the books. So the first one follows a girl's journey in colonial times from France to New Orleans. And Yeah, so it's, as the title would suggest, the main legend of the book is the Casquette Girls. So if you don't know what that legend is, I'm not going to tell you because it will spoil the book for you. But basically, the books take a lot of real New Orleans history and kind of tie them into this fantastical world. And I think the other thing to note, especially I guess for a New Orleans audience, is that the books take place in a like post-hurricane environment. And it's very important to the story because the storm has essentially affected every aspect of everyone's life and everyone's character arc. So it's kind of this idea that Adele and her father are coming back from a 3-month mandatory evacuation, and they're some of the early birds to come home, and everything is destroyed. And because everything looks so different because of the aftermath of the storm, it's hard to know when like unusual things start happening. So it kind of sets her on this murder mystery, and like she has to figure out how she's like inadvertently involved in the murder mystery, and that she and some others are like the only people probably who can stop it. So the second book, the Romeo Catchers, is a similar format in that it incorporates some of the like ghost-based urban legends in the French Quarter. Again, as the title would suggest, and the historical plotline in that book, it goes back another 100 years and is in Florence. And then the third book, the Cities of Dead, it really kind of focuses on the cemeteries in the city. And it starts to take you into one of the voodoo urban legends in the story. That historical plotline goes to Basque, and it goes back another 100 or so years. And then the fourth book, which just came out a month ago, The Gates to Guinée, goes full tilt into that voodoo urban legend that starts in book 3. And I would say it differs a bit from the previous 3 books and what will be the 5th book, in the fact that the other books are kind of like squarely urban fantasy, like very high amount of realism, even amongst all this like supernaturalness. And the fourth book, this one that we're talking about, it kind of is almost more like a portal fantasy. And that's not really giving anything away. Like once you get to book 3, you'll know exactly what that is. Or if you know what this name means, then you can easily ascertain why this one is a portal fantasy. But yeah, that's like a breakdown of the series thus far.
Yes, and it is a good series. The people who read this series just are obsessed with it. So for those of you watching, if you have not read it, you should, because the people who do read it super, super love it. And if you are watching and you have questions for Elise, I just want to mention this too. You can drop them in the chat, and I'm sure she'd be happy to answer them. There are a couple of people that have been.
I always like answering questions more than just having a giant monologue. So
yeah.
Please do.
So why did you decide to weave New Orleans legends into your books? Like, why use that?
Well, of course, as you already mentioned, I'm from New Orleans. I am born and raised, went to UNO, and then I left like the day after graduation. So I went to New York and was more or less there in some way, shape, or form, I guess, for like the next 15 years. So until pretty recently. So for the past, some amount of years, I've been going back and forth, and I kind of did like half here and half there. And there were some years in between where I was more international. But for most of my life, I've either been here or New York, with some stints in other countries. So I felt like I was kind of at that point in my life where like you've been in your career for probably 10 years and you're like, what am I doing with my life? And I hadn't really been home in a long time. So I was missing home. And I feel like at that point, ever since Katrina had happened, I had always kind of had this, like, a little bit of survivor's guilt sort of situation where I had left New Orleans a couple of years before that. And I think the part in the book that's really true for me, and obviously tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of other people, was just kind of like watching everything happen from afar and watching everything happen to not just like your loved ones and your friends and your family, but just like the city. And I always just kind of felt like, even though at the time, even though I can like viscerally remember feeling this way and thinking this like years before I ever wrote this book, like I have to do something one day for New Orleans. And I know that sounds so weird because at the time I was so young and there was nothing that I could do. You know, it's like you had this feeling of like, I'm going to quit my job and I'm going to move back home to like help. And then it was just like, help do what? You know, you're like 21, 22, you know, or whatever. Right now, you're like the only person in the whole family that has a job because no one has a job after Katrina. Like no one knows what's going on. So it's just like, what good are you going to do? How are you going to help anyone? Like I was more of a help to people being in New York and like flying people to New York and like letting them stay with me and finding places for them to stay, like my friends and stuff. So, but it never felt like enough, you know, and I guess just watching it happen, and I don't think it really mattered if you were in my situation or you were a resident watching it happen from afar from your mandatory evacuation. You kind of like have this moment of like, are we losing everything? And I don't just mean possessions, like the city, you know, like, yeah. Are we losing everything, you know, like everything that made us who we are, you know? And I just remember that feeling, like I can still remember it right now, like thinking about it. It's like making my voice shake, you know? And I remember just having this feeling of like, realizing how much the city had made me and given me, because I worked in a lot of creative fields in New York. And I just remember this weird feeling of like, one day I have to do something, like if the city makes it, you know, sort of thing, like I will do something to show my appreciation. And when I started writing this, it definitely wasn't a direct connection, you know, like, oh my God, this is the thing that I'm going to do, you know, not at all. It was, and I've told this story before, so I'll try to keep it short because I'm sure some people are like, oh my God, we've heard it so many times, but it was kind of like this trifecta. I was living in London at the time and I was taking a writing class, like a fantasy writing class. I had never written anything before, like since like college or whatever. And it was fantasy, sci-fi and fantasy, but very much not paranormal. Like that was not considered sci-fi and fantasy in this class. And I've always loved the paranormal. And especially at that time, like anything fantasy that I read was paranormal, or like gothic or horror. And at that same time, I was meeting and being acquainted with one of my grandfather's cousins who is a Ursuline nun. And I became fascinated with the Ursulines, and I ended up, just for my own personal reasons, reading all of this kind of like academic history and like academic text on the Ursulines, like their history in France and their role in colonial New Orleans. So it was just kind of like this weird, perfect like storm that at that time I like bought a house that was pretty close to the convent. I was doing all this research on the Ursulines and taking this class where this fantasy writing class, you know, and when the idea kind of came to me, it really wasn't necessarily because of New Orleans. It was, I'm going to go on a tiny tangent here and I'll come back around. It was at that time where it was like very cool to hate Stephenie Meyer and Twilight and like everything that goes with it. And I was not in the writing world. Oh, you're muted, so we can't hear you.
Sorry, I was saying it's still cool to hate Stephenie Meyer, but keep going.
I feel like there was a little renaissance like in the last year where it's like now cool to like Stephenie Meyer. I don't know. I can never keep up with it. Like I didn't understand it then because I wasn't from the writing world. I didn't even know that YA was a thing. And I was in this class and like the adults, this was all an adult class, like grown ass people. And all they talked about was like how much they hated Twilight and Stephenie Meyer. And I was just like, how do grown people hate anything this much? And hate like something for teenagers this much? Like, so I was kind of fascinated by that dynamic in the class. And I had never like read Twilight, seen the movies, anything, but I was not like generally well liked in the class. So because of that, just whole, like, I didn't know enough about sci-fi and fantasy and I liked paranormal stuff.
Were you like the vampire witch girl?
Yeah. I was already like ostracized in the class and we had to write like for the class or critique. And so I was just like, oh, well, I'm going to write a vampire story about a teenager because clearly all these people in the class will hate it and have to read it. So that doesn't like, that is more of an answer than just why did it end up getting set in New Orleans? But I feel like it's all kind of related of how the story was set in New Orleans, but also why it became a vampire story and all of these things. So
it was just a perfect storm of things, really.
Yeah. And I swear, like if each one of those things hadn't happened, this story probably wouldn't exist, you know? So it, you know, it is true about, I don't know, like, I think it was really meant to be. So.
Adele. And so at the beginning of this, I put in the chat, like, are you team Isaac or team Nico? And just because I'm like, I know there's gotta be some people who have read this already. And of course there's a love triangle in it because like it's paranormal YA. And so and somebody said like, I'm both, like I adore them equally, and like, you know, that's pretty fair. But I guess we'll see in book 5 how all of that ends up. So y'all have to wait another year or so for that.
It's really been fun seeing that evolution because it's very much not like something like Twilight where it's very apparent from the first chapter, like where this is going, where this love triangle is going. So people are always very nervous about it. And it's been very interesting watching people like at the end of book 1 feel like adamant about this is what I want to happen. This is how it needs to happen. This is why it needs to happen. And then like at the end of book 2, they're like, changed my mind. And then like at the end of book 3, like change their mind again. And then, so I feel like by book 4, people are like kind of solidly have made a decision, but we'll see. Cause I feel like they think that at the end of every book. So.
Oh, look, and now people are answering. So I'm really interested in this. And I know this is sort of a tangent, but it's also really fun. So, so here are all the answers to Nico or Isaac. This person adores them equally.
Thank you.
Let's see. Sarah Lee says, I love Nico, but I also like Isaac as well. Susan is totally team Isaac. So we have these people. Yeah, and you know, I haven't made up my mind yet about which one either.
That's
normally in these types of love triangles, I am team like shapeshifter werewolf. Like I'm not normally team vampire in these situations. Just because as a person, I'm just like, I don't know. Vampires kind of creep me out. And I just find werewolves and shapeshifters like super hot for some reason. So I'm always team shapeshifter werewolf. But yeah, look, there's war. Like, here we go. Team Isaac, Team Nico. People have opinions, Elise.
Oh, yes, I know. I get a lot of mail about
it. And so you have, let's talk about this for a second, since clearly there are fans here. So you have a fan group, right? And is it only on Facebook?
Right now it is. That's one of my goals this year, is to try to not necessarily move it. I don't want to freak people out. But Facebook is making things like more and more difficult as time goes to have like really engaged groups. So I'm going to try to make like a Discord server or something. And then of course there are the people that are not on Facebook and don't want to be on Facebook. So I get it. Sure. So my goal this year, hopefully sooner rather than later, is to try to create a Discord, and then maybe eventually the group will move. But I know that like some people are never going to do that. So there will always be some version of it on Facebook. I don't know, more to come. But yes, right now it's only on Facebook, and it's called The Attic. It's pretty easy to find. So if anyone wants to join, just send us a request.
And there are like rereads and read-alongs and all kinds of things in that group as well. So I assume that the people listening are all these people commenting, because the comments are still going on Team Nico and Team Isaac, but I assume that they're probably all in there. Someone just said straight out of the attic. So
yes.
So that's really cool. I'm glad that y'all are in there. I'm in that group too. So just, I'm not as active in it, but I do, like, I don't post in it a lot or chat in it, but I am there, and I'm like a creeper watching. So that is a thing. But
for people watching that aren't in it, it's like obviously very much about the books, but it's also just like people who really love New Orleans and like want to talk about New Orleans and their love for New Orleans and like stuff to do and paranormal stuff, and people who just love paranormal stuff, witchy stuff, like Southern Gothic stuff, literary Gothic, all of that kind of stuff. So yeah, it's
a pretty fun group, I think. And and yeah, if you don't belong to it and you want to, go find it, because it's a pretty cool group. And there was something I was going to say about this group, and now I've totally lost it and forgotten what that was.
Okay, I'm going to say this while you're thinking of it. So yeah. Casey just said we need shirts that say straight out of the attic. And I don't know if Susan can see her comment. So I'm going to answer for Susan and say there are shirts. And Susan, it's actually sitting on my bed right now, like, weird timing. Yes. So they wore them to the book 3 release and brought me one, and they're amazing.
That's really cool. So I'm just going to talk about this sense of community, because there's a real community that has built up around these books, which I think is so cool. So I just wanted you to talk a little bit about
you've seen like the whole evolution
of where, like, how were you able to sort of build up this amazing community around these books? Like, I sort of know the story of how it started on Wattpad, but just generally, how did this community sort of come about?
I will try to answer this, but it is a little bit of like guesswork, and it's a really, really good and interesting question. And Zoraida Cordova and Danielle Clayton have a podcast called Deadline City, which if you're into reading and writing, especially writing, I highly recommend going and subscribing to this podcast and like going back all the way to the beginning. I think they're on season 4 now, and listening, because it's full of like really great information. They have a lot of really good, not just cool, but like helpful and useful guests on the show, talking about really kind of like specialized topics, not just like, how do you write a book, but really like going into like different, like streamlined topics. And so we recorded, I don't know when it's going to air, but we recorded a few weeks ago, and they asked me that same question. And kind of the whole topic was around, like in and around community. I feel like my honest answer is I don't really know, because I feel like community is not something that you wake up and you're like, I'm going to form community today. And like, these are the things that I'm going to do it. Like, I think that's the thing about community and culture. Like, it forms itself like a living organism, and you can be a part of it, and kind of like try to shepherd it, or, I don't know, just kind of like direct it a bit, I guess. But you can't control it. And I firmly believe like you can't create it. Like even in the real world, like if you were like, I'm going to create a community and like, here's my building, and it's not gonna, you can't really do it. It's like the people that come are the ones that create the community. So when I wrote the original draft, I did write it on Wattpad, which is a social network for writers and readers, if anyone's unfamiliar. Although I feel like it's so big now that like most people know what it is. And the draft of the book there, I do feel like had a high sense of engagement, which is not necessarily community, but they're like sisters, engagement and community. And I believe that was because people were highly invested in the mystery of the book. So for anyone unfamiliar, it's like a serialized story. So you post it chapter by chapter, and there could be like a week or two potentially in between the chapters, and people can comment on them. So the comments were much more, because especially in book one, the romance is not front and center. Like it's almost tertiary. It builds as the series goes. So like the love triangle is like barely even a love triangle in book one, because I mean, I don't think this is a spoiler, but like no one really gets together in book one. Everyone's just kind of like meeting each other. The character arcs are just starting. I mean, you know where that's going to go. But so people were really just invested in trying to guess where the story was going and like who did what, who done it, all the different like subplots and like layers to the mystery and the clues and all of that. So it just, I think, had a high amount of chatter on the book for that. Whereas a lot of books, the main chatter is like, I love Nico, like stuff like that. But this, it did kind of build in that way. So I definitely feel like that happened, but I can't really say that then translated into what we have now, because I think we definitely have some people in the group that like have been along for that whole journey, like ever since then, like for sure we have some people in the group that are that. But my guess is that it's like 5%, like it's a very small amount of people, because that was a long time ago. And just like we were talking about before with like Facebook and Discord and this, it's like hard to get people. And there were years in between when the Wattpad thing happened and when the Facebook group ever started, So, I mean, of course, there were other ways to kind of stay in touch and engage, but I didn't write any of the other stories on Wattpad. So like once the first book was over and I took the book down, like that was kind of over there, So there were definitely years where there was no group, and even on Wattpad, it's not a formal group. So I don't really know. I mean, I think one of the things that has really helped, and like you have been there, so you kind of know, we do big events. And
they're awesome.
And it's not a thing that I ever anticipated would happen. It's not, even to this day, like, I'm like, no one's going to come, and then I don't have enough shit for the event, because like I even had to put it in other people's hands, because I get so bad at, oh, I'm sure like 30 people will come. And then like 230 people come, that I have to have other people now be like, yeah, let's order this many books. And not that, or, you know, like drinks or this or whatever. But the first event that we ever did, or like the first release party, I don't know if it was the first event, but was at Boutique de Vampire in the Quarter. And if anyone has ever been there, it is a very small boutique. And we, again, especially then, I was like going to be happy if like 12 people came, you know? And I don't remember how many people came, but like it was like we had the whole courtyard open and this, and like there was not enough room. And luckily we kind of had this like walking party situation. And then it happened, like we got a venue for the next book, and there were so many people there that I almost just like couldn't even function because I was so surprised. And then like, so part of it was in the church at the Ursuline Convent, and then part of it was at the Beauregard High House. And I remember like standing in front of the church and being like, this whole church is full of people. It's so weird.
It really was.
But then it happened just as hard at book 3, which we had at a club. And I remember like standing on stage at the club and like I'm staring out into a club of people, just like thinking in my head, like, how did this happen? So that really is my honest answer of like, I don't know. So yeah, of course, because of COVID this year, we couldn't have an event or like a live event, you know, so we've been trying to do stuff online. And, you know, we'll do a big event for book 5. I mean, maybe we'll do a delayed event for book 4, like once we're all vaccinated and not gonna endanger people. But I don't know. I mean, that's kind of how it happens. I think that the book also, because of the sense of community in the book, that kind of to me is New Orleans, and especially post-storm New Orleans, the community. And there's a lot of like coven stuff in the book. So I think it just kind of lends itself to like togetherness. But also like if you are a person like in your life that is more of like a solitude-y kind of person, an introvert, you can find your people like with us, because, and I think that people have met a lot of friends for that reason, you know, because obviously everyone's a book lover. Everyone, like there's a lot of like-minded stuff in the group. So I know that there's lots of like friend groups like within the bigger group now. So I don't know. It's cool. Maybe other people can answer the question better.
I think it's really cool too. And I did post as well, because I think it's cool. And clearly there are quite a few people watching who are part of the group or at least know about it. So yeah, like why don't y'all tell us why you became part of the community? Because that would be a really good question as well. Like what made you want to join this group and like be a part of this? And oh look, Sarah says that she joined because I needed updates on when the next books were coming out. That's fair.
Fair.
So yeah, if y'all have comments about why you became a part of it, I think that would be cool. And then Elise would be able to answer the question like, well, here's what people have said. Susan says they give great reading suggestions. So that's cool too. And Aspen says, I came across TCG while I was searching for a new book to read. I love New Orleans vampires and all things paranormal and mystical. And after I read the first book, I looked Elise Arden up to see if there were more books and ended up finding The Attic, which is really cool. And I think that says a lot about just readers, right? Because I think that readers do that. Like if you just randomly come across a book that you really like, you will totally like Google the author and like drop them online.
I do that. Yeah.
I do all the Like, what is this person doing? And then, I could see that happening, that you're like, ooh, like, are there other books? What is this person doing? Oh, look, there's a Facebook group. Oh, cool. The author is actually active in the Facebook group, and you can talk to them. And I think that part too, like you being an active part of the community and being sort of accessible to your readers, I think matters a lot for that as well. So yes, thank y'all for answering that question. That's pretty cool of y'all to do. And let's talk about urban fantasy for a minute, sort of specifically, because urban fantasy really is fascinating to me, because you sort of weave like the world building of it, I guess, because you weave like real world stuff in with the supernatural stuff as well. So can you talk a little bit about that and sort of your process of like, how do you know how much realness to put in there, and like where that stops and where the supernatural sort of begins? Because it's all very together, and it's like you as a reader, you can't really tell. So I'm just wondering, like, as a writer, like how do you mesh all of this together to make it so seamless?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like, I guess for every writer and series or book or whatever, it's different. And you're kind of choosing like on this spectrum of like reality to speculative, like where you want to sit and like which of the elements are the more speculative ones. For me with this series, it was real. Like I wanted it to be as real as possible. Now, don't feel like you're like, oh, is this a contemporary book? Like I want to read stuff about magic, because there's a lot of magic in it, and there's a lot of monsters, but it's kind of like the way it unfolds and the way that it's paced and the way that the explanations exist for the speculative elements in the story, I feel are like what makes things seamless, or how something can feel very blended with reality versus something that is super fantasy with real world elements, And it is probably my number one thing that I get after like, are you Team Isaac or Nico? Like letters that kind of start with like, I know this is going to sound crazy because there's vampires in the book, but I feel like this is real. And I love that, because I feel like, oh, I did my job as a writer, as an urban fantasy writer, in kind of the sense of urban fantasy that I'm trying to create. Because I feel like New Orleans specifically is a city that feels like magic is real and feels like magic happens, feels like monsters exist, feel like the dead walk down the streets. So I want that feeling to exist on the page in like every breath that the characters take, not just when the magic stuff is happening. So it's like, I want the realistic elements to feel always like magic is a possibility. And then I want the magical elements to always feel like they could be real. So that's, I guess, like an interesting dynamic, I guess, that I'm just always thinking about all the time when I'm doing any of it.
Yeah. And I think that, of course, I think that's what every urban fantasy writer sort of aspires to do, right? Is to make the magic feel real and make the real feel magical. And when it's successful, it's awesome. And there's a lot of really unsuccessful urban fantasy, which I won't mention, but yeah, I think a lot of people sort of try to do it, but it's very different from, high fantasy, where like everything is made up, whereas with urban fantasy, you do have like, not everything is made up. So I feel like it's sort of this patchwork world building that you kind of have to do with it, where it's like, okay, like how I guess my question in all this, since I'm rambling, is how do you like choose what elements of the real, and I mean, I guess in your situation, it's just like New Orleans, but you know, but I'm always interested in like, how do you pick and choose what elements are going to be real and grounded in real, and what sort of magical things you're going to throw in there?
All right. So I will answer and try to give a couple of examples too, to like make it more concrete. Yeah. So I would say that like my number one rule of thumb is like, I'm always going to use something real when I can. If it exists, I'm going to use something real. So, and of course it's all like inspired by, you know, so like, you know, Sacred Heart Academy, you know, versus where the Academy of the Sacred Heart or whatever it is, where like Adele goes to school, you know, like Noka, Nosa, you know, so some things like have to have this slight change just for like fiction's sake. There were a lot of things as far as like bars, restaurants, you know, whatever, stuff like that, that I actually like kind of brought back from the dead. So like places that didn't survive Katrina, for instance, or like other, you know, economic reasons, or like places more from like my childhood. So it's this kind of hodgepodge, like almost like homage to the quarter of like past, present. And yeah. So I would say that like, if there is something real, I'm always going to put that in before I make something up. Because to me, it just makes the story so much more rich. So like the coffee shop where Adele works doesn't exist anymore, but it existed when I was Adele's age and I worked at that coffee shop, you know? So there's a lot of stuff like that, that like, unless you also have like a few decades of French Quarter knowledge, like you might not ever know. And then there's some stuff, of course, like Bottom of the Cup Tea Room that has been there since the 1920s and is still there. You can go visit there. You can like see the tables that are described. You can see the crystal balls that are described. So here is like one element where it really starts to blend the real and the fantastical. And this is like probably as fantastical as something gets in the story. So it's in book 4, which is, you know, like I already said, it's a portal fantasy. So we're talking like a much higher level of fantasy in the book than in the first 3. So they're in the afterworld. It's not a spoiler, I promise. I guess I won't say the characters though, because that could be a spoiler. So they're kind of like on this mission and they get a clue to do the thing that they need to do. And they have to go down to the end of the world. So even like I would say in this instance, most people don't know what that is. Like even potentially that are here, because it's not as known as like the Garden District or something. And so they go there because 2 of the characters in the book know where that is. And there is a bunch of like blown out storm buildings, like and stuff like that. And there's a giant kind of like street art piece that says "Open Your Eyes," and it's relevant to the story in the book because they're looking for something and they're kind of like asking the universe, and they like kind of act like they are expecting to find this kind of like mermaid Loa there, and they're like, she's not here. This is just like the shitty Mississippi River. And then they look up and it's like, "Open your eyes." And they're like, "Our eyes are open." And they turn around and they see a Loa out on the river. And they're like, "Oh, that must be her." So they run out there and, you know, they're kind of like, "Are you her? Are you her?" And it's not. And she tells them that like, you are at the right place. Like she's down there. Like, why would the mermaid Loa be up here? Like she's down there in the water. So they have to collectively use their magic and go underwater, and they enter this kind of like whole like sub portal almost within this fantastical world. Now that is going to make the series sound much more fantasy than it is, but we get into some of that like bigger kind of fantastical stuff in book 4. But I think it's kind of illustrates what you're asking. So it's like, Into the World is real. They go there. The building, the blown out, like in the book Storm, in real world Katrina, naval building is there. The street art is there. Like you can go there. And then the river is there. But then the part where they go under the river and like have this whole like experience, kind of like spiritual experience underwater, is made up. But the thing is, if you're from here and you know like what really goes on out there, people do go out there like and have spiritual experiences, and it is kind of about like letting go of things. So it all kind of like full circle, but that's at like the deepest level. Like if you are kind of from here and you really know the real shit, you know. So that I think kind of illustrates like a full cycle of when I'm kind of going in between reality and fantasy in my urban fantasy like
Yeah, and that's awesome. And I think that there's, you know, especially in New Orleans, there is this sort of undercurrent of magic anyway that you can sort of just feel it when you're here. And so like I think that's why it's so believable to people that like, you know, all you have to do is like peel it back or tap into it, and like this whole thing comes alive, right? And I think that's just it's just so believable. It's always felt that way in the city to me. So I think it's really cool because it's kind of how I sort of view New Orleans anyway, that like around any corner or like under any water or, you know, like just there's like this fantastical world that we're living right next to. It just feels like that all the time here anyway.
Yeah, and I feel like you can still learn that, like even being like a hardcore local person or whatever, like on release day this year, which is always very hectic, you know, and I don't know if it was like actual release day or the day before or whatever, me and my PA went around town just like kind of taking photos with the book and stuff like that. And it was wild. And she's from here too. Like she's just as like hardcore New Orleans as us. And we were in like multiple different neighborhoods trying to just like go take some photos of some of the different places in the book, because in book 4, because I feel like when I post them on Instagram or whatever, a lot of times that is when people realize that it is real, like that I didn't make that thing up, that I can't take credit for that. So we were out at the end of the world. We were at Pop Fountain. We were like at a few different places, and it was crazy to me, even though like I know this, but like it's different, like knowing it and experiencing it in one day, in half a day, or however long it took us to do this, like how many different altars we found around town, just like in random places, like a random tree, a random fence, a random this. And so I was always kind of like putting the book by this random altar that someone or like someone's had just made in this neighborhood or on this, you know, in this kind of like found altars, like found art. And it just was so fitting for book 4 that it was almost like we were having a sublime experience doing this. It was just like really weirdly full circle.
Yeah, like, are we living inside the book?
Yeah, exactly. It was getting really meta.
That's so cool. And Susan has a question. She wants to know, why is there always a hint of purple? Is it a favorite color? Is there a deeper meaning to it? Why is everything purple?
I feel like I have 2 answers for this, and neither of them are deep. So normally my hair is purple. This is kind of like my COVID hair. And as I'm sure everyone here knows, so I feel like, granted, I wouldn't have been able to tell you this back in the day, but I feel like at this point, artists that I work with, like, make stuff purple for me. Like it's become a thing. Like even like artists that don't know me well, you know, or whatever. I just started to notice like on all kinds of different projects, like when something comes back, even if I haven't given like notes or direction or anything, like it comes back in some form of purple. So that to me is part of it. The only book that I think specifically requested, granted, I can't even specifically requested it. So I don't know if Galen did it on her own or if I requested it, would be for book 4, because book 4 is all about the Guinée and their colors are like black, purple, silver. So I definitely like wanted this strong sense of purple in book 4, but there's no excuse for all the other stuff. And it's funny that comes up. And so Zatanna, which there's like a really early sketch right here. And then this is the illustration for the cover. And you can see that she has purple hair. And even some of the people at DC were shocked to find out that, like, I did not request this. In fact, I was like, that's beautiful, but can we not do that? Because people are going to think that I made Zatanna's hair purple. And my editor and everyone was like, but it's so amazing. We have to do it. And I was like, I mean, it's awesome. Obviously, I love it, but everyone's going to think this. But I mean, it was the right choice. It's definitely the right choice for the story and it's great, but it's just, I don't know. It just like always comes into my life at this point to answer your question.
So yeah, it is just Elise's signature color now. Is just everything is purple. And people now, I guess, associate it with you.
For sure. I mean, I get at least multiple things a day of people just sending me stuff from the internet that's purple. Yeah.
Well, there you go. So if there are any other questions, y'all can drop them in the chat just as a reminder, and Elise will answer them because I'm not sure how many more questions I have, but we have like 10 minutes left maybe, or a little less. So if y'all have questions, please ask them. But I will ask about Adele specifically because I'm wondering like where she came from. You know, I know a lot of people wonder, like, is she like you at 16? Is she based on someone else? Like, who is Adele in your mind?
I mean, I definitely don't think that she's me. I mean, I know that people joke about that a lot. And I definitely think people who kind of like knew me then or like knew me when I was super young really joke about that. And there's definitely similarities with like even for instance, like the coffee shop and Bottom of the Cup and like places that I kind of like worked and hung out with as a teenager, and her dad. And definitely like growing up with my dad and like my relationship with my dad, I would say is probably the most reflective element, but that is like a dynamic, I would say, more than like, you know, her dad is not my dad and I'm not her, you know, but I don't know. I knew that she was the first thing that came before any of the idea, you know, really, or anything. Like when I was in that class, and even though like I told the story about the vampires and the Ursulines and all of that, which is totally true, but like the very, very first thing about the story that I saw was this teenage girl that did kind of like embody my experience of being in the quarter when I was younger, but her and her dad driving into the city after the evacuation. Like that was the first image that came to my mind for the book. And I was just completely attached to her, like from that moment on, you know, and I feel like the boys in the book dominate the conversation, you know, and I get why, but it really is Adele's story. And it's about the trauma, you know, that she experiences with the storm and like kind of the elements that have affected her and her family and like her friends and every aspect of her life. And of course, many other people's stories come into the series, you know, and there, you know, some people love Adele, some people hate Adele. But I wanted to just try to create as an authentic of a teenager, but not just any 16-year-old teenager, like a teenager that is growing up in the French Quarter, whose single father is a bar owner, you know, so like that teenager is going to be very different from a teenager growing up in like a suburb 30 minutes away. Just even that, like just in that. So she's flawed. She's not perfect. She makes mistakes. She suffers consequences. You know, from making those mistakes, she's learning how to deal with grief. She's learning how to deal with trauma, and she's learning how to deal with other people that are dealing with grief and trauma in ways that she doesn't process those things, you know? So, I mean, I think that is one of the more interesting elements of the book is like, okay, you're going to write a horror book or like a paranormal horror book, but you're going to set it in a place where every single person in the world is suffering from PTSD. So.
Yeah, and there are definitely moments. I have a very like adult view of Adele because like I you know, in reading this book, there are just moments where you're like, oh, Adele, no, baby, what are you doing?
I feel like that too, you know, when I'm writing it, or like that kind of like aunt or like older sister, or like older aunt, you know, kind of feeling. But I like have to let them do it because otherwise, like, I don't want it to be one of those books where it feels like all the teenagers are 40, you know, or have the wherewithal of like a matured 35-year-old. And some people might say like, well, these teenagers are way more mature than, you know, like my teenagers. But I'm like, well, yeah, because your teenagers aren't tasked with saving the world, you know, and like having gone through like, they've probably like gone through an experience that these kids have gone through or like something similar. But because of the nature of the books, they're like going through one after another, and like getting up and recovering from it and like learning from the mistakes or not learning from the mistakes and then having to fall down even harder. But I mean, it's fine. Like it creates a lot of debate and it creates a lot of conversation, which is, you know, what every author wants. And I think that people put their own experiences into the characters, and that's kind of how they decide if they love or they hate them. And I think that's one of the great things about reading, you know, that is even a bit more than like film and television and other media is like it is easier to put yourself into each one of those. And that's how I feel no matter what character I'm writing. If I'm in Isaac's POV or Nico's POV or Desiree's POV, it is, you know, that person's experience and how, like, what decision would they make? You know, not what decision would I make. If they all made, you know, if I made all their choices, there'd be no conflict in the book because I'm like, no, you were going to regret that. Don't do that. Learn from me. It's like, no, you got to go learn for yourself.
Yeah, it's and I'm not a parent, but I have to imagine it's a lot like being a parent. Like I'm just gonna let my baby characters go and do what they need to do and learn what they need to learn. And then you're sitting there like, oh God, why are you making this choice?
Well, and that it's funny that you bring that up because that an element of that often comes up in the Nico Isaac debate. And it's a very interesting dynamic of a certain group, like subset of the group that are moms of teenage boys. And they are always able to empathize more with Isaac, you know, who is the teenage boy and not the Immortal who's 400 years old. And Isaac makes major mistakes throughout the book. But when you can see your son or your brother or, you know, someone super important to you, like a nephew, you know, who's going through similar things and like making those mistakes. And you know that he is a good person and he's making these choices out of love and doing what he thinks is right and is saving people, you know, and stuff like that. And I mean, he makes a lot of mistakes because I put him in the most horrid situations of all the characters, I think. Granted, that's all subjective, but it's been super interesting kind of seeing different people's takes, like young people's takes versus like more experienced people's takes versus mothers' takes. I mean, you and I are both don't have children. So like kind of our takes. But I mean, that's kind of the fun of books, right? And I think that is part of the community because people really want to discuss things. I mean, we get into some deep discussions on like who was right and who was wrong and who made the right choice in the book and who should be blamed. And they can get like quite intense. These discussions in the group. So usually with that, I am being more an observer and like I'll interject if someone asks me to, but or I'll kind of give my opinion on it, but I'm never going to give anything away, or I'm never going to like a character more than another because I am the cheerleader for whatever character I'm writing in that moment, you know?
Yeah, and that's what I have to imagine. Like, do people ask you if your team, like,
like
I'm sure
20 times a day.
And are you like, I mean, I'm team everyone because I'm writing this story?
Yeah, I mean, people definitely at this point know that I'm never going to answer that question. And I think even at this point, they understand that I don't have an answer to that question. I'm not just trying to be coy because the book is told from a multi-person POV. And if I am writing in Isaac's point of view, I am 110% team Isaac. Like, he is my like number one priority. And it's the same if I'm writing Nico. And it's the same if I'm writing Adele. You know, like the choices are being made for Adele and what she thinks is right. And that's based on her background, her personality, how she would like weight the consequences and like the aftermath of what would happen based on the decisions that she makes, you know? And I feel like you have to be that way. Otherwise, like you're just showing your hand as an author of like where the book is going. And I know that when I'm reading books, I don't want to see that as a reader. Like I want to be like fully invested as like an audience kind of observer of the story. And, you know, like of course I love foreshadowing and stuff like that, but like, I want to feel like I need to read the book to find out what happened.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Fun fact, which is why I only watched one episode of that show, The Undoing, and quit watching it. Because I mean, that was a show that, this is tangential to what we're talking about, but it was a show that I guess when it was on, everyone was like really invested in the whodunit aspect.
That's the Nicole Kidman, like kind of recent one. Yeah.
Yeah. Everyone was really invested. And I watched it. It was done when I tried to watch it. But apparently like the zeitgeist around this show was that
I watched it in real time. Yeah.
Oh, you did? Okay.
Yeah.
So yeah, like everybody was really invested in like the whole whodunit of it all.
Mm-hmm.
And like what was going to happen. And then the ending was so disappointing to like the vast majority of people, which I didn't know when I started to try to watch it. And so I watched one episode and I was like, I don't understand why people like this show. It is boring as all hell. Like I thought it was so boring. I'm like, why is anybody watching this show? It's very clear to me who done it, which apparently in the zeitgeist it is, but then like the show sort of brings you back and forth, but then like, sorry for spoilers, y'all, the end, it's exactly what you think. And so when I looked it up, I was like, I'm going to look up and see what the conversation around this is. And the conversation around it was that people were disappointed in the ending. And I was like, and so then I looked it all up and I was like, yeah, I'm not watching this.
Yeah, I would say like there were two things why I think that the buzz was so intense. And I think that for like neither of them have anything to do with the show. I think that people are so used to binge watching stuff at this point. Yeah. That it's exciting to not binge watch something. And it brings me back to the day of like when you actually had to wait a week and it was so much more fun to watch TV. I'm totally anti binge watching. You know, where it's like you would watch the episode of Buffy, go to school, talk about it.
Yeah, exactly.
You know, until you could watch the next one. And I think that's why to this day, I can still remember more stuff from the TV shows that I watched, like 20 years ago versus stuff like if you were like, in season 2 of Game of Thrones, I would have been like, I don't remember, dude. And I've seen the whole series twice and I still I know the broad strokes, but and that is true also of 1 month after I had watched it. I have the same recall as what I would have now. So I would say, collectively, it was the first time as a people we were kind of watching something in real time again. Not that other stuff hasn't been in real time, but it just to me felt like almost kind of a phenomenon when we were doing it. And I do think COVID had something to do with it as well, because it was still pretty early on in COVID and we were not used to it yet, and kind of definitely all having that cabin fever, kind of thing. So I think anything that was giving a sense of community and a zeitgeist, kind of had a zeitgeist to be a part of and all of that, it was just right for it. But then I will definitely say at the end, it felt did they get 80% through this and then COVID happened and then they just ended it?
Yeah. And I think that's why, a lot of people, I'm a big Marvel fan. I watched every single thing. I love WandaVision, which is a new show on Disney Plus. And so I've seen so many people complain that they didn't release the series all at once. They've been releasing it one a week. And I'm like, oh man, but I love it. I love that they're releasing one a week because it has created that. After every episode, people are online talking about it. It's oh, what's gonna happen with this or whatever. And that's where I feel I'm with you on the binge watching thing. The shows to me that lend themselves the best to binge watching are 30-minute comedy TV where it doesn't matter if you remember it or not. I like to binge watch those kinds of shows because it's whatever, this is just to make me feel good in the moment. But yeah, and generally no. But it is over an hour now, so this has been a fun conversation, Elise. Thank you so much for just chilling
for having me, and thanks for everyone who's here. And if you're watching this sometime in the future, if you leave questions, I will attempt to come back and answer them in the comments. But that might be very delayed. If you want to come join our Facebook group, we can put a link in the comments. But of course, if you are watching this in the future and you are new to the series, Candace has signed books, signed paperbacks of all of the books.
I do. And so just to show you again, this is what the 4th book looks like, which is the newest book in the series, Gates of Guinée. The first book is the Casquette Girls. And we have signed copies of all 4 books at Tubby and Coos, which is really cool. You can also get a bundle deal. So if you haven't read the series yet, you can get all 4 books for $50, which is a discount on if you would buy them individually. So if you want that, all 4 books signed for $50, we will ship them to you if you want. You can come pick them up from the store, whatever works best for you. You can also just buy the first one or just buy the 4th one or buy any combination of them that you want. Just buy the books. And so, but yes, if you want all 4 of them, they're out for $50. Elise has confirmed for us in this conversation that the 5th one is going to come out at some point next year. And that will be the last one. So I'm looking forward to that party because I did miss the party for this one because it was so much fun. So yes, thank you to everyone who is watching and who has commented. The chat has been actually fairly active, which is cool during this. So I appreciate y'all's participation too. And clearly, most of y'all watching probably have this book, but if you don't, or if you're watching later or whatever, please go ahead and purchase it. And thank you, Elise, for chatting with me. And it looks like everyone's really excited about a possible party next year. So
definitely.
All right.
As soon as we can all, physically engage with each other without threat of
people dying. Yeah.
I know. That's what I was going to say, but I'm like, why are you always so dark?
Well,
it's the truth.
It's the truth.
Okay, thank you everyone who came, especially people from the attic. So I see just like the few of you lingering: Sarah, Sierra, Alice, Susan, Raven. I will see you guys on the internet.
Yeah. Bye, y'all.
Bye.